Chapter 9. I've looked through the blasted thing countless times, see if I could decipher even a fragment of his madness. Most of it is the ramblings and ravings of a lunatic. How that man managed to fool the imperial court into thinking he held even the bare sliver of sanity by the end is beyond me. Eileen's muttering was more to herself than directed at Hubert. She dragged out a small locked chest from underneath her bed and plunked the box down on a nearby table, using the palm of her hand to wipe away the thick coat of dust caked on its surface, and stirring the fluffy particles into a musty cloud. Eileen fished around the box on her bedside table that contained a sparse collection of jewelry, grinning with a cheery "Aha!" when she pulled the tiny bronze key out from amongst the long coils of aged silver chains. The chest was unlocked with a light click, and the lid thrown open. Hubert stepped closer, looking over his mother's shoulder at the contents tucked away inside. To an untrained eye, the box appeared to contain little more than scribbled scraps of parchment, with entire lines and paragraphs crossed out, and cramped, near illegible writing scratched in the margins. A sight that may be encountered upon stumbling upon an author's discarded writing drafts. And truthfully, the delirious writings in the box could hardly be described as anything of more value than that. Hubert plucked one of the pages from the chest. His brow furrowed, and eyes narrowed in concentration as he pored over every scrawled word. His mother had been largely correct. Many of the pages included massive swaths of rambling, disjointed scribbles, with only the barest semblance of lucid thought. Hubert knew that much of his father's sanity had corroded into frothing splinters by the time he managed to sink a dagger into the heart of the miserable wretch. Every page was composed of code, built of utter nonsense. Hubert could recognize bits and pieces from different ciphers he had mastered over the years, but even once translated, the words remained cryptic and irrational. A passage, starting as an acute observation of suspicious activity from a fleet of merchant ships, would quickly careen into delusional diatribes connecting the positioning of the stars with an illness that several members of the imperial court had been afflicted with. The deranged code, concealing the words, held little recognizable pattern, as if it had been abruptly changed partway through a sentence, distorting and concealing the unhinged ramblings from the very mind that had concocted them. Hubert leafed through the yellowed, frayed parchment scraps, his frown deepening. One of the pages had the phrase, "They are everywhere. Trust no one," written over and over again, until the words piled on top of one another, a latticework of madness cobbled together of letter, smeared ink, and frenzy. Another page detailed the fragmented account of an incident in which Hubert's father had corralled together a group of 20 servants who had been working in the east wing of the palace. Every one of them had been slaughtered, their bodies dissected. The old Marquis had believed them all to have been impostors wearing stolen skins. Not a single one had carried the markers of the face-stealers. It had taken the full extent of the Vestra spy network to conceal the incident from the public. That had not been the first time the former Marquis had recklessly butchered the innocent during his hunt, nor would it be the last. Hubert had already known that his father had stumbled upon those who slither in the dark, both through his own investigation while planning with Edelgard, and later through a detailed ledger that had been entrusted to him upon taking the role as the head of House Vestra. The first accounts of the former Marquis encountering the Cabal had taken place around the same time as the revolts of House Rim, and about 3 years before the insurrection of the Seven. The investigation notes had become straightforward enough, sightings of suspicious mages, wielding dangerous magic, kidnappings, disappearances, murders, and other crimes that had been tied to the group. However, the more he had unearthed of the malign faction lurking in Fodlan's shadows, the more disturbed the writings became. It had not taken long for most of the findings to collapse into little more than the panic scribbles of "They wear our faces," and "Nowhere is safe." The deterioration had corresponded nearly perfectly with when the former Marquis's violent and controlling tendencies towards his family began to escalate, when the already brutal Vestra spy training became torturous. It was unclear what the former Marquis's breaking point had been, or when exactly it had taken place, but it was obvious the wretch had eventually ended up collaborating with the very maggots he had hunted, and, although Hubert could never prove it, he greatly suspected his father's involvement with the insurrection was largely due to this twisted cooperation. Hubert was already aware of the miserable piece of filth's role in capturing the Hresvelg children years later. Some may have pitied the man for stumbling across such a revelation, a dark faction of unspeakably powerful abominations infiltrating every corner of Fodlan society, wielding technology and dark magic far beyond what was considered a possibility, an enemy who could potentially wear the face of anyone, even a dear friend or loved one, driven mad from paranoia only to align himself with his greatest foes out of fear. And perhaps, had the man not channeled his fear, his bubbling frustration and rage, and his obsessive suspicions into a sharpened blade of cruelty that was wielded against his own family, Hubert may have been able to rustle up a sliver of sympathy for his abominable excuse of a father. The revelation only made Hubert hate the man even more, that he knew full well the depth of depravity that those who slither in the dark were capable of, that he was willing to sacrifice children, the very children he swore to protect, to their monstrous experiments that had left most of the sons and daughters of the Hresvelg line either dead or driven to insanity. Hubert shuffled through the box, unrolling more tattered scrolls and setting them aside with a shake of his head once they revealed nothing of use. As Hubert pored through more swaths of graffitied lunacy, Professor Hanneman's words kept circling in his head, making him grit his teeth. Although the Crest researcher had meant well, just thinking about the conversation made Hubert's nerves bristle. The suggestion that the abhorrent actions of Hubert's father, siding with those who slither in the dark, may have been done out of some selfless desire to protect others. Even if that were the case, it did not erase the scores of pain and terror the Marquis had inflicted on his wife and children, scars that faded, but never fully disappeared from their bodies, nightmares that would always cling to the corners of their minds. The last page, buried at the bottom of the box, contained no words. Instead, the parchment was scrawled with sloping lines that curved into sharp peaks before sweeping downward. The line marks vaguely resembled the waves of an ocean, but beyond that, they contained little information that Hubert could decipher. "Can you make anything of it?" his mother asked with a worried frown. Hubert's face scrunched into a grimace. He tilted the page from side to side, turned it upside down, held it up to the sunlight streaming through the window, even cast a dispelling charm on the page in the off chance it had been encased within illusion magic that somehow escaped detection. Nothing. The page remained unchanged, a scribbled menagerie of unwieldy squiggles, composed with the artistic talent of a toddler. I am afraid whatever secrets kept locked within that loathsome slug's mind remain with him in the grave. Hubert sighed, the page slipping from his fingers and floating back inside the box. I suspected as much. I don't know why I bothered to hold on to this blasted thing all these years, Eileen muttered, gesturing at the chest of documents with a heavy sigh. I suppose I was hoping for a shred of something good to come from all the misery we were put through. There's no point in holding on to the wretched thing any more, though I'll let you decide what we should do with it. Hubert's mouth curled into another frown as he placed the documents back in the box and snapped the lid shut. His first instinct was to take the tiny chest out back and light its contents on fire, purge every last shred of the vile filth from existence. Then again, Hubert had hit a dead end regarding his own research into those who slither in the dark, despite Thales and his acolytes becoming more brazen with actions of late. The remnants of their attacks and experiments had left nothing that Hubert was not already aware of. Although he seriously doubted it, it was possible that the miserable, conniving traitor may have stumbled upon something that was missed. I thank you for bringing this to my attention, Mother, Hubert said with a small smile. Although I was not able to glean much insight into the twisted workings of his mind, perhaps one day there may prove to be something useful within his findings. If you don't mind, I would like to take the box back to Garreg Mach to examine the documents once more. Eileen frowned, but nodded her head in agreement. I understand. But please, don't let this hunt consume you as it did your father. She rested a gentle hand on his shoulder. As I said, there are many who care about you and would gladly fight by your side. You need only ask. Do not face this threat alone. Hubert nodded quietly, avoiding his mother's worried gaze as he locked the small chest and handed the key back to his mother. As they went to leave Eileen's room, the sunlight shining through the windows dimmed, and a large shadow flowed across the gardens, covering the cottage clearing in a dark blanket. The flap of large wing beats sounded from overhead, the noise not dissimilar to a ship's sails billowing in the wind. Wisps of a miasma spell began swirling around Hubert's fingertips, his body bracing into a tense, defensive position. Eileen gently placed a hand on Hubert's raised arm, pushing it gently to the ground. Hubert let the spell flicker away and fade at his mother's reassuring nod. "It looks as if Matilda and Theodore have returned from their flight," Eileen said with a proud smile as she glanced out the window and watched the large shadow sweep over the trampled grass. "I can imagine Maddie will want to show you all of the aerial tricks and daring dives she can perform with Buttercup. Hopefully she will be satisfied with me observing her growing talents from the safety of the ground," Hubert said lightly, ignoring the small cartwheel his stomach performed. Hubert followed his mother out of the room and made their way outside. "Well, you must be quite proud," he smiled as they passed through the sitting room. "It sounds as if Matilda has taken after your Pegasus riding talents." Several of the letters Hubert had received had briefly mentioned his younger sister's enthusiasm towards flying and her growing skills, although he had absolutely no intent of taking to the skies unless under the most dire of circumstances. A part of him could not help but feel a smidgen of envy towards Matilda, gliding through the skies from atop a Pegasus and basking in the lofty view, fulfilling the childhood dream that would always be out of Hubert's reach. Nevertheless, he was happy for his sister, and was eager to witness Matilda's growing talent. "You may wish to reassess the observation when she actually returns." His mother smirked as she stepped outside. She raised a hand to her face to shield her eyes from the streamers of sun that were not smoldered by the oncoming shadow, and looked to the sky with a smile on her face. Hubert frowned as he listened carefully to the cacophony of heavy flaps closing in on the clearing. The wing beats sounded more like the whip-like ripples of heavy leather rather than the soft rustle of feathers he would expect from a Pegasus. He looked up, squinting, only for his eyes to snap wide and his jaw to drop. Gliding over the canopy of trees and swooping down into the cottage clearing was a massive wyvern, wings outstretched and sun shimmering from its burgundy scales. Hubert shot a sideways glance at Eileen. Somehow, his mother's letters had neglected to include exactly what Matilda was riding. Eileen only smirked in response, waving up to her other two children as she made her way across the cottage grounds to where the winged beast was landing. They were soon joined by Ferdinand, as well as Sylvain, who had been drawn by the noise and encroaching shadows. The wyvern hovered in place, over a large patch of grass that had clearly been trampled by the beast many times, as its rider slowly guided them down for a smooth landing. Wickedly sharp, gnarled talons clawed at the grass, and the wyvern grunted as it sniffed the ground with long, scaly snout, its wings curling back against its body like a folded paper fan. Two riders, a man and a woman, who were both younger than Hubert, but sporting the same hair color and similar bone structure, sat atop the flying beast. The woman was garbed in scratched, dented light armor typically used by wyvern riders. A hefty bolt axe, with a scent of ozone wafting from the blade, was strapped to the wyvern's saddle and close to her hand. The young man was clothed in simple riding leathers and a tunic, a basic longbow and quiver of arrows strapped to his back. Although taller, he clung to the woman sitting in front of him. Both waved excitedly to their audience, watching them from the ground. The woman, Matilda, slid down from the wyvern first. She sprinted towards Hubert, a bright grin lighting her face, and threw herself at her older brother. Hubert caught her with a warm chuckle and a tight embrace. He grunted slightly as her arms wrapped around him with seemingly enough strength to crack his ribs and knock the air from his lungs. He shook his head with a fond smile and returned the embrace. Matilda always did enjoy bone-crushing hugs. Almost immediately, she pulled away from the hug and punched Hubert in the shoulder. "Where have you been?" she demanded, her hands on her hips and an angry scowl on her face, not dissimilar to her mother's. "It's been 5 void damned years! 5!" Hubert chuckled and rubbed his sore shoulder. Although it was clear the punch was intended to be playful in nature, he still winced a bit at the hit. Clearly, someone had been attending grappler lessons. "It's lovely to see you too, Matilda," Hubert teased. "I see you have selected an interesting choice of steed." Hubert grimaced as he gestured towards the wyvern. As if sensing the mage's disdain, the beast rose its head and snarled in Hubert's direction. He narrowed his eyes and scowled at the creature, the flickers of a miasma spell ready at his fingertips. "This is Buttercup." Matilda nodded proudly to the beast beside her. "A valiant queen of the skies, and my trusty companion." Buttercup ambled closer and rested a head on Matilda's shoulder, while her owner showered the beast with accolades. The wyvern leaned her head against her rider's palm as Matilda scratched gently at her burgundy scales, a contented growl rumbling in the beast's chest. Hubert could not help but glower at the giant reptile that had draped her head over Matilda's shoulder. Although Hubert would not consider himself particularly fond of animals, his soft spot for Pegasi and his minor partiality towards cats and some birds aside, he always had an especial disliking towards wyverns. Unlike his trepidation towards heights, he was unable to pinpoint his aversion to the beasts with a particular moment in his life. Perhaps it was their unpredictable, short-tempered nature, their uncanny ability to sense when someone is uneasy around them, their hostile and even violent reactions towards magic, or the fact that making any practical use of the damnable beasts involved soaring at altitudes that would make Hubert lose his lunch. During the early days of the professor leading the Black Eagles class, she had been testing the range of combat abilities for the students, and, despite Hubert's fervent protestations, had insisted he attempt wyvern riding and take part in skywatch duties. In a way, he had been fortunate. Flying the wyverns had not been an issue, since Hubert had not even been able to get within 3 feet of any of the winged beasts before they snapped their jaws and growled at him. Most animals and beasts reacted poorly around him once they caught a whiff of the lingering dark magic residue that always clung to him. But wyverns had always been especially vicious towards Hubert during the rare times he was forced to be in close proximity to them. Between that and the memo drenched in hints of his acrophobia that he had left in the cathedral ask box, the professor had permanently removed him from skywatch rotation and had not brought up the subject of wyvern riding since. Ah, yes, who wouldn't want to soar miles above the ground atop a volatile, unpredictable, oversized lizard with the temperament of a rapid boar and the brain capacity of an inebriated snail that would throw off its rider at the slightest sign of inconvenience? Hubert sneered lightly in a droll tone. His nose twitched at the wyvern's pungent scent. A stench of old leather caked in baked sweat. He forced the miasma spell away, but kept his eyes narrowed at the wyvern. Matilda gasped, with dramatically exaggerated outrage. "This is a lady of House Vestre you are speaking so appallingly of. I may just feed you to Buttercup for uttering such slander towards her." Matilda huffed and crossed her arms. "It would be what you deserve for staying away for so long." Hubert merely chuckled at the threat and the grumpy scowl Matilda was shooting him. He resisted the urge to ruffle her hair like he used to when they were children. Matilda's gaze drifted to the 2 knights who were chatting with Eileen in curious voices. Their glances darting to Hubert and his sister, while they maintained a distance let the siblings become reacquainted. Matilda leaned close to Hubert's ear, a wicked smirk on her face. "So, which paladin's the one you've been oogling?" she whispered, nodding at Ferdinand and Sylvain with a raised eyebrow. What?" Hubert sputtered. He blinked, shaking his head and schooling his face into a neutral expression, while desperately ignoring the scorching heat sweeping across his skin. "I haven't the faintest idea with which you speak." Hubert cleared his throat and spoke in a cool tone that clashed wildly with the crimson blanketing his face. Matilda rolled her eyes. "Your letters, Hubert. you spend a great deal of time fawning over some red-haired paladin named Ferdinand. Though, first time you've shown your face here in over 5 years, and you brought 2 red-haired paladins home. So now I just have more questions. And tell me, Hubert said with a creeping grin as he quickly recalled some of his younger sister's hobbies, has your wealth of knowledge concerning romantic relations been honed from countless hours poring over the mountains of pulp romances you have tucked away in every corner of your room? That? Matilda stammered, her own face now pantomiming the shade of a tomato. What you suggest is utter nonsense. You'll need to work on your delivery and composure if you expect even the most mundane of your fibs to bear any ounce of believability. Hubert chuckled, earning an eye roll from his sister. Very well. Though, if you are not going to answer my question... Matilda leaned around Hubert with a mischievous smirk. Which one of you horse-obsessed, overly chivalrous blockheads is Ferdinand? She shouted at the 2 knights. Hubert groaned and ducked his head, desperately trying to hold back the scorching blush that was determined to flood his face. Both knights balked at the blunt question. Ferdinand took a hesitant step forward. That would be me, Ferdinand von Eyre. He greeted the young woman with a polite bow and earnest smile. You must be Hubert's sister, Matilda, right? It is an honor to meet. I hear you're skilled in nearly every type of weaponry and form of combat imaginable. She drew the bolt-axe from Buttercup's saddle and pointed the weapon at Ferdinand. I demand that you duel me at once. I wish to judge for myself just how much hyperbole Hubert's letters are drenched in. Pardon? Years of etiquette training collapsed into dust as Ferdinand stuttered to respond. His formal but warm greeting quickly morphing into alarmed bewilderment. His eyes darted between the 2 Vestra siblings, his jaw still hanging open. Hubert has spoken quite highly and extensively of your combat prowess, and it has been some time since I have faced a worthy opponent in combat. Matilda grinned with playful malice. Now, do you accept, or will you scurry away in cowardice? Ferdinand turned to Hubert with a pleading look. It appears you have been issued a formal challenge, Ferdinand. Hubert hummed with a dark, teasing lilt that matched his sister's. It would be quite ignoble of you to refuse such a request from an aspiring warrior, would it not? I suppose? Ferdinand stammered, looking to Eileen and Sylvain with an expression that silently begged them to intervene. Hey, don't look at me. I'm not the one she's pointing that axe at. Sylvain chuckled, raising his hands in a defensive gesture. Besides, you wouldn't turn down a request from a lovely lady of one of Adrestia's noble households. Sylvain winked as he spoke the words. Eileen only shook her head with an exasperated sigh, but a fond smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. Very well, I accept your challenge, Matilda, but do not expect me to hold back. Ferdinand grinned, slipping back into his usual confidence. I would be disappointed if you fought me with anything less. Matilda smirked, with a small cackle that sounded alarmingly similar to her older brother's. Sparks danced along the sharp edge of her bolt-axe, weaving and arcing in crackling strips of jagged light. Training weapons only, Maddie. Eileen warmed her firmly with a stern look. Ferdinand is our guest, and his mother will be staying with us for a while, too. I would much prefer not to have to explain to Penelope why her son lost a limb during a foolish sparring match. Matilda paused mid-stride, the arm holding the bolt-axe slumping, her glee melting into a sullen frown. Is he not a renowned imperial general? Hubert's sister pouted. Surely the mighty Ferdinand von Eyre can survive one measly round of combat against a lowly wyvern rider such as myself. Matilda? Fine, very well. Matilda huffed with a dramatic sigh and tossed her bolt-axe to the ground. Come along, General Eyre. The training weapons are kept in a shed around back. She grabbed onto Ferdinand's sleeve and tugged him away from the group. Ferdinand sent a look of mingled alarm and confusion over his shoulder at Hubert as he was dragged away. The maid shook his head and chuckled at the exchange. Hubert? The maid smiled and turned to the soft voice calling his name. The tone was different, deeper than he remembered, but recognizable nonetheless. Standing behind Buttercup, and nearly hidden by the wyvern's folded wings, was Hubert's younger brother, Theodore. The young man, clearly having gone through a hefty growth spurt during Hubert's 5-year absence, was a collection of long, gangly limbs, and stood at the same height as his older brother, if not a smidge taller. He peeked his head around the leathery, sail-like wings with a shy smile. Hubert quickly strode to his younger brother and drew him into a warm embrace. The two brothers chuckled, Theodore tucking his head against Hubert's shoulder, his arms tightening around the mage. A slight pang tickled at Hubert's chest as he hugged his brother. Theodore had only been 13 and over a foot shorter than Hubert the last time he had seen him. Now the two brothers could almost pass as twins. "Well, Theo, you have certainly grown these past few years," Hubert smiled, noting the change in height, as well as the sharp facial features that had lost traces of baby fat, giving his face a countenance similar to his mother and older siblings. Theodore looked nearly identical to how Hubert did during his academy days. Theodore nodded and hummed at the observation. He opened his mouth to say something when a set of approaching footsteps made him freeze. "Hey, did you really carve all those faces in the trees back in the woods? 'Cause those were amazing!" Sylvain shoved himself in the midst of the two brothers, like an energetic hound begging for attention. "That old man face we saw on the way here scared the crap out of me, in a good way. The wrinkles, the soft texture of the beard. How did you make it so lifelike?" Theodore stiffened and took a step back, moving away from the eager knight. Shoulders hunched into a defensive stance, and eyes narrowed with suspicion. A flicker of worry crossed his face as he sent a sideways glance towards Hubert. It was not unusual for Theodore to not speak for long periods of time when anxious, sometimes going days at a time without saying a word. "Theodore, this is Sylvain, one of the Adrestian army's generals, and a friend of mine," Hubert explained in a soft voice, not missing the way Sylvain brightened at the word friend. "He can be a bit overbearing at times, but I assure you, he means no harm." "Yeah, guess I came on a little strong. I tend to have that effect on people," Sylvain said with a small, self-deprecating chuckle as he scratched the back of his head. "Sorry about that, but I really do think your wood carvings are pretty great. Your mom said there were more of them in the woods. Maybe you can show them to me? Only if you want to, though." Theodore did not say anything in response, but he did nod at Sylvain and offer him a small smile. The group eventually made their way around back, where Ferdinand and Matilda were finishing their sparring session. Matilda had been knocked to the ground, Ferdinand's wooden trading lance pointed at her chest. Both were flushed and panting heavily. "Your sister is quite the formidable opponent," Ferdinand chuckled as he reached down and helped Matilda back to her feet.
"I suppose I will concede that your writings of General Eyre's martial talents are accurate enough,"
Matilda sighed as she dusted dirt and clumps of grass from her armor and tunic. She elbowed Ferdinand with an impish smirk.
"Though, don't think I'll be bested so easily when it's time for our rematch."
"I would expect nothing less," Ferdinand grinned. With the duel concluded, Matilda had clambered atop Buttercup's back and took to the skies, demanding that the cottage's visitors witness her aerial acrobatics. Once in the sky, she performed an impressive series of loops, spins, and rolls. Hubert tried not to visibly cringe as he watched her and her wyvern hurtle towards the earth in a spiraling corkscrew pattern, only to veer up at the last second with a mighty flap of the beast's wings, sending massive gusts of wind washing over the spectators. Buttercup landed moments later. Her rider performed a sweeping bow while shooting Hubert a self-satisfied grin. "Well, you managed to not turn yourself into a gory smear. Consider me impressed," Hubert teased, his sister sticking out her tongue at him in a childish rebuttal. With a grumbled promise to her mother that she would be back in a couple of hours, Matilda took Buttercup's reins and led the wyvern into the surrounding forest in search of game for the beast's dinner. Theodore led Ferdinand and Sylvain to the edge of the tree line, where he was showing the paladins more of the tree carvings he had completed, while Aileen went back inside to check on Penelope. With his siblings, mother, and the two knights preoccupied, Hubert drifted his way towards the stables, from which he could hear Luna's soft whinnies. The black Pegasus was in her stall, head bowed, as she nibbled at the hay in her feed trough. Wings of dark feathers, soft like ebony snowflakes, fluttered and unfurled slightly at the sound of her approaching visitor. She lifted her head as Hubert's footsteps neared her stall. "It has been some time, old friend," Hubert said warmly,
as he scratched behind Luna's ear and ran his hand across her glossy coat. Luna nuzzled against the mage's palm with a sigh of contentment. Hubert smiled and reached into a nearby container that held her oats and offered a palmful of treats to Luna. He chuckled as her snout tickled his hand, and the Pegasus quickly gobbled the small pile of oats. Considering how controlling the old Marquis was by the end, and the sick delight he seemed to feel when taking away any source of comfort from his wife and children, it was a miracle that Hubert's mother had convinced him to hold on to the Pegasus. The Marquis likely believed disposing of the animal was not worth the hassle. Furthermore, given that Luna's damaged wing had left her incapable of flying, the Pegasus was of no greater risk at providing a means of escape for the Vestra family members as any of the Marquis's horses. Hubert continued to pat the Pegasus, Luna's soft coat under his palm sending tendrils of warmth through him that eased some of the tension that had wrapped around his nerves since his trip to Baramas. His ears perked at the heavy tread of footsteps approaching the stables. "Well, it would seem as if those rumors of your fondness for Pegasi are true after all," came Ferdinand's teasing voice. "Stumbling upon a Vestra's well-guarded secret." Hubert grinned, turning to the other man. "You tread awfully dangerous territory, Ferdinand. Many have tried to blackmail members of my house, only to wind up in shallow graves themselves. I suppose it is a good thing that it would be most ignoble of me to spread such gossip." Ferdinand chuckled. He nodded towards the Pegasus. "Might I ask your companion's name?" "This is Luna." Hubert smiled, as he scratched at the velvety black fur along her neck. "My mother's Pegasus from when she was a dark flyer. She has been with my family since before I was born." Ferdinand blinked, looking between Hubert and Luna. "Do you mean to say this is the very same Pegasus your mother was thrown from when she was—" "Yes," Hubert sighed, "though, I will say, it was only today that I became aware of my presence during that incident." Ferdinand chuckled and shook his head. "It is lovely to meet you, Luna. I am Ferdinand von Eyre." The paladin included a sweeping bow to the Pegasus with his introduction. "And, might I say, it is an absolute honor to meet a decorated war hero such as yourself." He leaned against the gate to Luna's stall, reaching out a hand and allowing the Pegasus to sniff his palm. Luna regarded him warily for a moment, before nuzzling against the offered hand. Ferdinand smiled and giggled lightly in response, a beautiful, warm sound, like the melodic clink of wind chimes in the soft summer breeze, the way the setting sun tangled with the long strands of woven copper, highlighting the hair with threads of twinkling firelight. Hubert quickly averted his gaze when Ferdinand looked back in his direction. Heat burned along the sharp edges of Hubert's cheekbones. "I must say, Luna is quite affable. Not many Pegasi are open to receiving pats and treats from men they are unfamiliar with." Ferdinand smiled. "Well, she has put up with my dour presence for decades." Hubert shrugged, with a self-deprecating smirk. "Surely she would have no difficulty warming up to your sunny disposition." "Well, you certainly are more amiable towards Pegasi than you are towards wyverns," Ferdinand teased. "You appeared far from thrilled at Matilda's choice of steed." Hubert groaned and rolled his eyes. "Of all the horses and Pegasi available, she chooses one of those accursed flying lizards." Hubert grumbled, and with an amused sigh, "I fail to see how anyone can find appeal in those foul, temperamental beasts." "You mean stubborn, proud, occasionally vicious, but also loyal and deeply protective?" A grin stretched across Ferdinand's face. "Why, they almost remind me of someone else I know." "My, Ferdinand, I did not realize you had attained this level of self-awareness." Hubert chuckled as he offered another palmful of oats to Luna. "Self-aware? I beg your pardon?" Ferdinand gasped at the mage. "I was in no way referring to myself when outlining those characteristics. You are greatly exaggerating my stubbornness and pride I hold. And since when have I been vicious?" "Clearly, you have never seen yourself on the battlefield." Hubert leered, a distinct, husky smokiness seeping into his voice. He blinked, and forced a cough to cover up his expectedly wanton shift in tone, while banishing the tantalizing images of Ferdinand, sweat-slicked skin, muscles taut, hair swirling around him like a cascade of flames, face painted with the delectable heated fury as he faced his opponents, engrossed in combat from his mind. "You make me sound absolutely barbaric." The feigned indignation in Ferdinand's tone soon collapsed into a fit of contagious laughter that soon had Hubert joining in as well. They leaned against the stable gate, wheezing lightly between giggles. Once the laughter faded away, the two men went quiet for a time, Luna's soft neighs and the rustle of her wings filling the silence. "Oh, I have something for you. I picked it up during our journey here." Ferdinand's eyes lit up as he reached into his pocket with a bright smile. He pulled out a tiny white flower, a yarrow. The stem was crumpled from spending time in Ferdinand's pocket, and a number of petals were missing, but the flower remained cheerful and pretty nonetheless. Ferdinand reached up, brushing Hubert's bangs aside, Hubert's breath hitching sharply, and his heart stuttering at the gentle touch, and tucked the small flower behind the mage's ear. "There," Ferdinand beamed. "What do you think? I believe the white petals pair quite nicely with your dark hair." Hubert frowned, his eyes drifting to the stray bits of hay scattered across the stable floor, unable to Ferdinand's smiling face. Although weighing less than a feather, the tiny feather by his ear felt like a scalding boulder of hot coal. So gentle, so thoughtful and kind. Ferdinand, watching him with such open affection, just like that little boy who snuck into the manor to visit him on one of his darkest days. It tied Hubert's stomach into a rope of knots. "Oh, I am sorry." Ferdinand's bright smile melted away. "If you do not like it, I can—" Ferdinand reached for the flower again, only to be stopped by Hubert grasping his wrist. The two men remained frozen for a second, with Ferdinand's arm still raised, caught by the mage's hand. Hubert's eyes glanced up to see the paladin watching him with a look of worried confusion. The concerned expression only added another block of lead to Hubert's churning stomach. He sighed and released the other man's wrist. "Ferdinand." Hubert swallowed thickly, his next words feeling like wasp stings along his throat. "I must apologize for how I treated you as a child all those years ago. That day when you visited me in the manor to check on my well-being, when you brought me the bouquet of yarrows as a gift. I reacted in a manner that was most abhorrent." Hubert paused to take a breath. He could not bring himself to look at Ferdinand's face. "I mocked your thoughtful gesture, sneered at your kindness. My behavior was deplorable. I was not in the best state of mind that day. However, that is no excuse for how I treated you. For that, I am truly sorry." Hubert cringed as he forced out the final words, body tensed and braced for the other man's reaction. Ferdinand stared at him, blinking, before erupting into a surprised burst of laughter. "Hubert!" Ferdinand grinned. "That was years ago. We were children at the time. Please do not tell me that incident has been weighing on you all this time." No," Hubert muttered. He shuffled awkwardly in place and averted his gaze. "Truthfully, I had not thought much about the incident until recently." Hubert trailed off, unable to verbalize the bridged connection between the childhood memory and his growing fondness for the paladin. "Well, I would be lying if I said your reaction did not upset me. In fact, I was quite hurt by what you said, and that incident may have soured my initial opinion of you when we were first reunited at Garreg Mach. But," Ferdinand hastily added, as he noticed Hubert flinch, "we have both grown much since then. I do not hold what happened that day against you. I thank you for the apology, but please, do not let it trouble you further." Hubert sighed. Apologizing for the yarrows had chiseled away a fragment of the guilt sitting in his stomach, like a set of heavy rocks, but another matter continued to weigh on his mind. "Is something still the matter?" Ferdinand frowned, watching him with concerned eyes. He reached out and placed a comforting hand on Hubert's shoulder. Hubert wanted to lean into the touch, savor Ferdinand's warmth, but the hand felt like a brand against his skin as his stomach continued to curdle. "Ferdinand, I am afraid I have not been entirely forthright as to my reasoning for being in Boramus," Hubert said with a heavy sigh. "I told you I was in the city to investigate a matter regarding those who slither in the dark, though those words were not the full truth. Another pit in Hubert's stomach, more rocks sloshing around in his guts, wanting to be purged. I do not understand. Ferdinand's frown of concern turned to one of confusion. Were you not in Baramas for a different purpose? The rock in Hubert's stomach tumbled, bouncing around like shaken beads of an infant's rattle. The words needed to come out. His stomach would expel them forcefully if Hubert did not voice them soon. He swallowed past the waves of queasiness and spoke again. I had received intel that you had been receiving correspondence from an unknown origin, letters from a secret admirer, I was told. Hubert cringed as the words poured out of his mouth. The explanation sounded even more ridiculous out loud than it did in his head. When I heard you were traveling to Baramas to meet the writer of said letters, I followed you to Eyre territory. I knew I was overstepping, yet I persisted. I truly am sorry. There. It was out. A confession laid out at Ferdinand's feet, one that did not deserve absolution. Hubert had no idea how believers in the Church of Saros ever thought that confession could ease the spirit in any way. He had laid bare the web of lies he had spun, yet he still felt ill. Surprisingly, Ferdinand did not appear upset about the revelation. Instead, his chest began to quake, as if struggling to contain a hearty laugh. Oh? A smirk and a mischievous glint lit Ferdinand's face. And why would a letter from a secret admirer be such a cause of concern? Hubert swallowed heavily at the sly, crafty smile directed at him. The heated gaze from those amber eyes, so similar to the way Ferdinand watched him dance on the battlefield. He could not be mistaken for anything else. This was it, the moment Hubert had been waiting for. Hubert took a deep breath and responded. You are one of the Imperial Army's most valued generals, and a gifted orator with keen insight as to how the Empire can reform its education system. It is clear that you will have a future in Adrestian politics, working closely at Lady Edelgard's side. There are many vile swine who would see you as a valuable target. A letter of romantic interest could be an easily disguised ruse, concealing duplicitous intent. They could have been trying to court your attention as a means of extorting money, or an attempt to lure you into a vulnerable state for an assassination plot. These are all risks that cannot be taken lightly, and must be investigated with great diligence. Coward. Oh! Ferdinand deflated momentarily, before springing back to his usual cheerful demeanor. Well, I thank you for your concern. Even if your reasoning for being in Baramas was not what you originally told me, I am eternally grateful for your help in protecting my mother nonetheless. Hubert hummed and nodded in acknowledgement, while his mind screamed at him for his colossal ineptitude to spit out just a handful of words. The two men gave Luna some more treats and pats, and eventually made their way back to the cottage. Theodore was sitting on the steps, whittling a fresh piece of wood and humming a tune from an old opera. He froze when he heard Hubert and Ferdinand approach, eyes snapping up, and the blade held in front of him defensively. He eased his guard once his eyes fell on Hubert and Ferdinand, and offered a timid but friendly smile to the two men. Inside the cottage, Sylvain was busy chatting with Hubert's mother, pointing animatedly at different magic artifacts that were kept inside a nondescript curio situated in the sitting room. The paladin's excited voice carried all the way to the entrance. Wait, you can actually talk to people through these stones? Sylvain gasped incredulously as he pointed at a set of dull paradots in the glass cabinet. It's not quite as simple as that, Eileen said with a small smile. The sending stones come as a pair, and each person wielding a stone must have a strong telepathic bond, though the art of such magic is all but lost, even outside of Fodland. At the moment, they are little more than decorative rocks, a relic to an extinct branch of magic. Wow! There used to be people who could speak to each other with just their minds? Sylvain crouched. His eyes narrowed as he peered at the next shelf of artifacts. He nodded towards a box of brightly colored ruby gems. What about those? Those are Morphese warp gems. They were given to me as a wedding gift before I moved to Fodland, Eileen explained. One of her fingers tapped lightly at the glass. Warp gems? Do they work the same as the light magic warp spells? Sylvain asked. looking up at the grimoire. Somewhat, though they have a much further range, and can be used by anyone, regardless of magic talent. Neat. And what about that thing? Sylvain pointed towards a porcelain object, tucked in the back, and coated with chipped blue paint. Does it unleash a bunch of angry ghosts if it's broken? That is a vase. Okay, so it can summon some sort of magical plant to eat enemies, right? No, it's just a vase. The exchange continued until Sylvain had exhausted every object, magical or otherwise, that was kept in the curio. Eventually, Eileen and Ferdinand excused themselves to check on Penelope, leaving Hubert and Sylvain in the sitting room. The Fargus paladin had turned to Hubert with a bright grin. "She's from Morphise! The Morphise! Metropolis of magic and city of illusion!" Sylvain squeaked, like an adoring fan meeting their favorite opera star. "Yes, Sylvain, I am aware of my own mother's homeland," Hubert chuckled dryly. "So how did that even happen?" Sylvain asked. "I'm no expert on Adrestian politics, but I'm pretty sure the imperial noble families follow the same, intermarrying with other noble families for power, lands, and access to crest bloodlines that the kingdom sticks to." "A fair question," said Hubert, "and you are correct. The families among imperial nobility do select marriage candidates for their children based on those qualities, and tend to intermarry amongst one another as a result. You may have noticed, but House Vestra differs quite a bit from other noble households in the Empire. We hold no lands, nor does our bloodline contain any crests, although our family's traditional role as the Emperor's closest confidants places us in an enviable position of power within Adrestia's political system. The lack of lands and crests tied to our name, not to mention our controversial reputation, does not allure many marriage candidates from other noble families. However, what House Vestra does trade in and values is knowledge, whether it is confidential information on a potential adversary, words of hidden threats to the Empire, or access to rare resources. The mages of Morphise contain vast fountains of knowledge that Fodlan has barely been able to scratch, some of which that has been forcibly smothered by the Torch of Seros. My mother is the daughter of a prominent Morphisi scholar who had made numerous discoveries into dark magic applications in medicine, specifically forensic reconstructions of deceased that can be used to ascertain certain causes of death in the case of severe decay, or identifying hard-to-trace poisons that cannot be detected by light magic practitioners. "Reconstructing the deceased?" Sylvain's eyes went wide. "Wait, your grandfather was a necromancer?" Hubert rolled his eyes and pressed a palm to his face. "Nothing quite so fantastical, I assure you," he groaned. "Necromancy is not a feasible form of magic. If it did exist at one point, it has long since gone extinct. What I speak of is simply bending and rearranging decay until the body can be recognized or a cause of death becomes apparent. Although somewhat repaired, life cannot be restored to the cadavers. Though we are migrating away from your original question concerning my family's origins. Dark magic practitioners are rare in Fodland, and such research would be immensely beneficial to House Vestra and its network of spies. Seeing as prominent families in Morphise were also seeking to establish ties with Fodland, having my mother and father wed was mutually beneficial for both families. The betrothal proposed by my paternal grandparents was agreed upon quite readily. Though such an arrangement was hardly the first occurrence. I had a great-grandmother who hailed from Dagda." "Damn," Sylvain whistled, with a look of awe. "I knew you Vestras were different, but damn! How come I've never heard of any of this before? Is this some family secret?" "Not particularly," Hubert said with a shrug. "Many rumors surround House Vestra, many of which are exaggerations or full-fledged fabrications. The ambiguity serves us well, and we do little to dispel most of the rumors. Most are aware of our reputation, and are rightfully cautious about how deep they dig into our matters." "So I guess that makes you half Morphisi? Well, that explains why your magic attacks pack a hell of a punch. I've only seen crest bearers dish out the kind of magic damage I've seen you launch on the battlefield. So, have you ever visited Morphise? Met your maternal grandparents?" "No, I have not," replied Hubert in a clipped tone. My duties have kept me occupied for little time for frivolous trips outside the continent. Also, although my mother does not speak of it often, relations between her family and the Vestras have turned somewhat sour over the last few years. Not enough to call for retaliation on either side, but communication has waned over time. Though I must say, I applaud your restraint for not slipping into your more dubious habits when interacting with women. Hubert chuckled. Hey, I'm not that eager to die. The look on Sylvain's face was a mix between cringe and a heated glare. I knew you'd have half of Enbar redecorated with my organs if I so much as wink at your mom or sister. Though, if you're asking, I wasn't. It was not long before evening washed over the cottage. Hubert, Ferdinand, and Eileen were in the kitchen preparing dinner, while Matilda, having returned from her hunt, dragged Sylvain and Theodore outside. Hubert stood at the kitchen counter, plucking feathers from the 4 pheasants they would be cooking for that night's dinner. A small but growing mound of fluffy plumage was pushed to the side. It was fortunate that the larder had been stocked with the birds, Theodore having hunted them a couple days earlier. Ferdinand was busy chopping onions and garlic, shredding cabbage, and grating carrots for the meal, while Eileen gathered jars of spices and carefully selected the sprigs of dry herbs she would need from her collection. Numerous eggs rested in a nearby bowl, waiting to be cooked over a skillet. Already, the scents of chopped garlic, rosemary, sage, and thyme floated through the air in a flavorful melody of herbal fragrances. The savory aroma, mixed with the anticipation of soon enjoying one of his favorite dishes, was enough to make Hubert's mouth water and his stomach rumble. There is some fresh broccoli and cauliflower that I just picked from the garden that would go quite nicely with this dish. They're in the basket by your feet. Ferdinand, would you mind chopping some of them up as well? Eileen asked, nodded towards the small bushel of vegetables on the ground. That will be no trouble at all. Ferdinand grinned, and reached down and plucked a head of broccoli from the basket, and began chopping at the green florets. Typically, this recipe only calls for cabbage as far as added vegetables go, Hubert pointed out wryly, as he finished plucking the last of the feathers. He grabbed a nearby knife and began cutting away the wings, feet, and neck from the pheasants. I see your palate has not become more amicable towards vegetables these last few years, Eileen quipped with a raised eyebrow. She turned to Ferdinand with a smirk. Did you know I had to drown his vegetables in meat sauce to disguise what he was eating? Otherwise, he would just spit them out with the most dramatic yuck noise. Well, I do know Hubert can be rather particular about what he eats, Ferdinand teased. That ruse was only successful until I was about 4, Hubert huffed, now working at removing the innards from the pheasants and plopping them into a nearby bowl to be fed to Buttercup. I will have you know, Mother, that I have taken it upon myself to ensure that the Imperial Army's troops receive proper, well-balanced meals that are rich in vitamins. No one cares more about the nutrition and health of the food prepared in our kitchens than myself, even if that means concealing vegetables within meals that do not normally accompany such a meal. So that was you! Ferdinand laughed. You are aware that your habit of sneaking vegetables into unexpected meals has led Lysithea to believe that the kitchens are haunted, and that the inhabiting spectre has a personal vendetta against her. The sounds of chopping, slicing, and chatter continued, warm and sprightly, like sunny spring afternoon. The ever-present tension carried in Hubert's shoulders and down his back slowly seeped from his body and faded away, lulling him into a sense of relaxation he had not felt for some time. Hubert finished cleaning the birds and began slicing at the pheasant breast, cutting the bird meat into thin strips. Looks like we used up most of the water for the tea, Eileen frowned as she tipped the near-empty basin towards herself. I'll have to go fetch some more from the well. Here, Ferdinand cut in with a bright smile, gently taking the basin from Eileen's hands. Allow me to fetch the water for you. With that, Ferdinand dashed outside and in the direction of the well. Eileen shook her head and smiled. She joined Hubert at the counter as he continued to cut the pheasant meat into thin slices that would be ready for sautéing. Ferdinand is quite a lovely young man, Eileen smirked, with a sing-song chirp to her words, and teasing elbow aimed at Hubert's side. Hubert grit his teeth and hummed in acknowledgment. Flames washed across his cheeks, and his heart thumped in his chest. Kind-hearted, dedicated, and, dare I say, quite handsome too. Another hum, and more gnashing of teeth. Hubert kept his focus on the knife, and the pheasant he was cutting up. That's a lovely flower in your hair, by the way. Hubert resisted the urge to hide the yarrow from sight. The flames burning at his skin roared into a crimson inferno. Once realizing Hubert had no intention of responding to her not-so-subtle observations of the paladin, she switched topics. "Your friend from Fargus is most inquisitive on the ways of magic," Eileen commented with a light chuckle. She took over Ferdinand's task of chopping vegetables, her hands a blur as she carved white florets from a head of cauliflower. "He was telling me all about how you've been helping him, and that apparently the two of you have been working together to develop a portable fire orb. He has recently come to realize that he has an aptitude for spellcraft, and has been badgering me to assist him ever since," Hubert grumbled half-heartedly, a fond smile quirking the corners of his mouth upwards. "I apologize if his barrage of questions were a nuisance." "It's no bother at all. It has been some time since I have had such an engaged pupil," Eileen smiled, "although Maddie and Theo certainly have an aptitude for the craft as well. I would say that their interest lay largely elsewhere. While we are on that topic, about Matilda's choice of steed, I must inquire as to how exactly you managed to secure a wyvern." Hubert grimaced, with an uneasy sideways glance towards his mother. Wyverns were normally distributed through military channels and needed a specially signed requisition from an imperial officer in order to obtain one. Although his mother and siblings were certainly not shackled to the cottage and could carry out their lives as they pleased, it was essential that they maintained a low profile whilst the war still raged and those who slither in the dark remained a threat. "Oh, you needn't worry. Our identities weren't compromised during Buttercup's procurement," Hubert's mother said with a light chuckle. "The local guild of wyvern couriers had an extra clutch of eggs that they were selling at a nearby market. So long as Matilda promised to care for the beast herself, I agreed that she could take one of the eggs home. Matilda has raised Buttercup since she was a hatchling, and the two have been inseparable since." "I see," Hubert said with a curt nod. Eileen paused her chopping and frowned at the reaction. "I don't suppose you'll tell me what's troubling you, or why it's so paramount that our identities and location remain a secret?" Eileen sighed, her brow crinkled with sadness. "I know that your position affords you many enemies, but we are not so defenseless. I may be getting older, but I can still handle myself in a fight just fine. Furthermore, Maddie and Theo are no longer children, and they have shared with me their desire to join you in assisting with the war effort." "No!" The single word came out far more harshly than Hubert had intended. It cut through the air, razor-sharp and piercing like an arrow. Hubert had slammed his fist against the counter as he spoke, the jars and dishware rattling at the impact. He leaned against the table, a ragged breath tangled in his lungs. Dark curls fell over his eyes as he ducked his head, refusing to meet his mother's gaze. His whole body shook. If it had been up to Hubert, his mother and siblings would have been relocated overseas to Morphis immediately after the old Marquis's death. Eileen had adamantly refused, stating there was absolutely no way she could leave the continent while one of her children was mired in combat. It had been a struggle to keep his mother from joining the war effort herself. Reluctantly, Hubert had agreed to the compromise that his family would go into hiding, stay at a run-down cottage in Hrim that belonged to a deceased distant family member. "Hubert!" Eileen's soft voice and gentle touch on his quaking shoulder made him flinch. A soft touch pressed at his skin and tilted his face so that he was staring directly into Eileen's worried face. She swept away the fringe of bangs that covered his right eye, a gesture that had always brought him comfort since he was a young child. Her eyes blinked rapidly, desperately holding back the saline droplets gathered in her citrine eyes. "Please, talk to me," she begged. Hubert sighed, his whole body slumping like a puppet with its strings cut. The urge to redirect the conversation, bury the tumultuous worries under another layer of indifference, swelled inside him. With gritted teeth, he pushed the instinct down. He could not keep his mother in the dark any longer, not after everything Hubert's family had gone through. In hushed words, Hubert spoke briefly about the monsters he hunted. He told her of Kranya and sullen, demons who garbed themselves in the flesh of others and masqueraded their stolen identities. He spoke of the kidnappings, the experiments. What might have been Lady Penelope's fate had Meissen not been stopped. Hubert also told her of the part Thaddeus von Vestra had played, and his eventual cooperation with the monsters. He did not dare tell her of Arundel. It was highly likely she would attempt to assassinate the monster herself, if she realized who, or what, was wearing the nobleman's skin. Although Hubert would love nothing more than to see the loathsome maggot reduced to a pincushion of darkspikes, retaliation from those who slither in the dark was too much a risk while the church and kingdom remained a threat. Not to mention, there was a high probability that, although his mother was a powerful gramarye, she would likely be killed or abducted during the attempt. Hubert shuddered, the thought of his mother being captured and replaced by one of the monsters, making him physically ill. In the corner of his eye, he could see his mother's posture stiffen, the way she held her breath, the worried look she shot in his direction, as Hubert imparted tales of those who could steal and wear the skin of others. The anger flashed in her eyes, as Hubert told her the old Marquis's role in their malevolent machinations. The hand on his shoulder squeezed, offering a measure of solace. Hubert had not realized he had been shaking until that moment. I often heard Thaddeus mutter to himself of shapeshifters who could crawl into the skins of others, and wear their flayed flesh like a theatre costume piece. She grimaced, her eyes haunted and swirling with decades of nightmarish memories. I had thought that he was jumping at ghosts that only he could see. Eileen clenched her fists to control the shaking in her arms. Purple wisps of miasma briefly swirled around her hands before being swiftly snuffed out. It was Hubert's turn to offer a comforting hand, placing his palm on her quaking shoulder. She sniffed and looked up at him past the dark, grey-streaked bangs that fell in front of her face. It would be a simple matter to ascribe the former Marquis's foul nature to his fear of those who slither in the dark, but the reality was quite different. Even before his hunt of those who slither in the dark had poisoned his mind, Thaddeus von Vestra was far from what could be considered a good man. There had been a time, although exceptionally brief, and beyond the limits of Hubert's own memory, when he and both of his parents had lived together in harmony, a recently wedded couple, raising a young child. Although the Vestras remained loyal servants to the Emperor and his family, personal vassals were only assigned to royal children who bore crests, a tradition passed down since the foundation of the Empire. Without a crest-bearer among the Emperor's children, the urgency for Hubert to begin his training had not reached its head. The late Marquis had always held a disposition towards dour aloofness. However, a whetstone had not been applied to his cruelty until Hubert began his training at the age of 5, in preparation for him to become a vassal for Lady Edelgard, the first and only crest-bearing Herresfolk children of that generation. The lessons had started simple enough. Hubert would be brought to an evening gala, ball, or other formal gathering of Adrestia's nobles. The instructions his father had given him were simple: toddle over to a nearby group of dignitaries and counts chatting amongst one another, listen in on their conversation unseen, and report what he had learned back to his father. It had been a game, not so different from the countless rounds of hide-and-seek he adored playing with his parents, quietly hiding in a dark space and jumping out at them, his parents gasping with feigned shock. He had been good at his assigned tasks. He was never caught, and his memory was sharp, making repeating the captured whispers a simple endeavor. Hubert would even go so far as to admit he enjoyed those first lessons with his father. His efforts were rewarded with a treat of sweet, sticky toffee and praises from his father. Everything had changed during his first interrogation. Hubert did not recall the man's name, but he did recognize him as a visiting diplomat he had been ordered to eavesdrop on the night prior. The room was dark and reeked of sweat, ammonia, and copper. The man was tied to a chair, his fancy silk tunic torn and bloodied, a swath of bruises painted around the man's eyes and mouth, turning his face into a swollen lump. But even so, Hubert could see the terrified look in the man's eyes as he writhed in his restraints, screams muffled by the strip of fabric gagging his mouth. Hubert's father stood over the other man, like a looming reaper, An array of crimson-smeared sharp tools lay on a table beside. "You have 3 questions, Hubert." The Marquis had spoken in words of razor ice. "Find out who this man bribed." The gag was removed, and the man babbled and sobbed for mercy. Hubert had been frozen. The words stuck in his throat like syrup. The man continued to weep and beg. He had not been able to utter a single word. It ended with his father slitting the man's throat, and Hubert screaming in terror. The details of that memory were not clear, but he remembered vomiting in a corner, hyperventilating as sobs choked his chest and smothered the air from his lungs. He remembered his father offering him another sticky toffee after the ordeal. The candy had tasted like rot in his mouth. He thought he was going to throw up again. The lesson repeated until Hubert could voice the questions, until he could elicit a confession from whichever unfortunate soul his father had ensnared. More candies were offered. He shied away from the treats, as if they were snapping vipers. He remembered the twisted snarl on his father's face when Hubert began to protest more forcibly against the lessons. When the proverbial carrot had started to fail, the stick was introduced. Eventually, the training started to include Mithridism. Poison slipped into his meals to build immunity. The first instance had left him violently ill for days. He remembered his parents arguing that night as he lay in bed, chills racking his body, the taste of vomit clinging to his mouth, a near-delirious fog clouding his mind. "He will be entering the Hresfog Child's Service shortly. Testing for poisons will be one of his duties." "He is 5! Thaddeus! 5!" The lessons continued. Things had only gotten worse. Only 2 things brought Hubert solace during that time: that his siblings had been spared from being subjected to the same harsh treatment, due to there being no other crest-bearing Hresfog children, and his growing companionship with Lady Edelgard, his lady liege, and the one he was sworn to protect. Soon the Marquis had come across those who slither in the dark, and the man's already volatile nature became even more violent. The Vestra family had largely withdrawn from Adrestian society, only seen and spoken of in shadow. No one had spoke of his mother's bruises, nor their attempt to flee the city that one night, as if remaining silent about the incident would banish it from existence and scrub the horrors from their memories. The manor remained a prison. The magic dampening wards were dropped once, the day Hubert had been dragged back home after 3 days of fighting off his father's agents in a poorly thought-out attempt to reach Edelgard and Ferdinand. Eileen had healed Hubert's scrapes, bruises, and a cracked rib, all while glaring murderously at the Marquis, who watched them with a sullen condemnation. He had been furious when he found out that his wife had taken advantage of the lurid wards to warp Ferdinand in and out of the manor when he tried to visit Hubert with a bouquet of yarrows in hand. Since Lady Edelgard's departure to the kingdom, the Marquis had withdrawn in on himself even further, walling himself away in his study the rare times he was present at the manor. Good riddance, as far as Hubert was concerned. The lessons finally came to a halt. It was about 3 years after Lady Edelgard had been taken away from him. Hubert had heard a rumor that Lady Edelgard had been spotted in the palace. He had raced there, hope flickering in his chest like the morning rays of a summer day. It was the happiest he had felt in ages. Hopeful warmth immediately froze over with horror. Lady Edelgard was there, walking through the halls. She waved, smiling brightly as she spotted Hubert. However, as she was about to sprint to him, a set of arms wrapped around her and lifted her from the ground. Hubert gasped in horror as his father grabbed Lady Edelgard and began to carry her away. Lady Edelgard had kicked and thrashed, but to no avail. Hubert ran to help her. His father, Edelgard still in his arms and struggling to break his grasp, barked an order to someone standing behind Hubert. A noxious-smelling cloth had been pressed to Hubert's mouth and nose. The world around him swirled into black. When he came to, his father was sitting in a chair next to him. "You had a dream, Hubert," his father had barked, eyes flashing, a warning, but also a heavy sheen of what could only be described as fear. Nothing more. The words were a lie. Hubert knew that instantly. Days later, Hubert had snuck back into the palace. He had heard rumors from the palace staff that there was a great deal of commotion coming from the dungeons. With careful, Creeping steps, Hubert snuck into the bowels of the palace. He had not found Lady Edelgard, but he did come across one of her siblings. It was one of her older brothers, chained to a wall, and snarling at the shadows like a rabid beast. His once pristine formal wear was torn and smeared with blood. He tried to charge at Hubert when he noticed the younger boy. The chains pulled taut, and he snapped his jaw at the visitor. Bloodshot eyes that held no trace of recognition or sanity stared through Hubert. Terrified, Hubert had fled the room, only to crash into two men, Lord Arundel, sneering down at him with malicious delight, and Hubert's father, face frozen with unmasked horror. "Ah, this must be your eldest child. Hubert, am I correct?" Arundel had leered down at him with a contorted smile, the grin of something not accustomed to a human face. Hubert's father had silently dragged him by the arm and dragged him away from the dungeons. Once they reached the manor, his father had thrown Hubert to the floor in front of the fireplace. The Marquis grabbed a nearby fire poker and began to beat his son. Hubert had whimpered and flinched away from every hit. Most of the strikes were done with the flat edge of the poker, but the blows were nearly strong enough to crack bone. It was far from the first time he had been on the receiving end of such an attack, but it was the first time his father had beaten him while consumed with such a volcanic rage. Over and over, the blows did not stop. The Marquis had screamed at him with every strike, spittle flying from his mouth, face twisted into the visage of a snarling beast. During a couple hits, the poker shifted, and the sharp edge drove into his flesh. Hubert curled himself into a ball, tucked his face into his arms, and did his best to shield himself. There was a moment that he did not think the attacks would cease until he was dead. "Stop it!" A young voice had screamed the words. Hubert still remembered that moment with horrifying clarity. Theodore, standing between Hubert and their father, quivering arms outstretched, the young boy quaking with hiccuped sobs as his tiny body shielded Hubert from their father's wrath. Their father's hand had frozen mid-strike, a look of horror on the man's face as he regarded his sons. It was at that point Matilda had come screaming out, charging at their father and punching at the man with a flurry of her tiny fists, screaming bloody murder. A shatter of glass had ripped their attention to the other side of the room. Eileen stood there, a large, broken shard of a smashed vase held in her hands, and pointed at the Marquis like a dagger. Like a fearsome lioness protecting her cubs, Eileen had circled around, placing herself between her husband and children, the sharp fragment held out and ready to shred the monster before them. Her features curled into a nearly unrecognizable snarl. Rage vibrated from her body in quaking ripples. "If you ever lay a hand on any of my children again!" The Marquis at least had the decency to look mortified at the state he had left his family in. Hubert lay bruised and bleeding on the ground, Theodore standing over him, weeping, and standing protectively over his older brother, Matilda screaming and hammering at him with her small fists, Eileen, furious, and ready to slit her husband's throat. The fire poker fell to the ground with a loud clatter. Silently, the Marquis drifted from the room, a spectre banished for a short time. The next day, still sore and covered in barely healed bruises and cuts, Hubert had limped his way to the manor kitchens. A strange scent caught his attention, a floral aroma that was somehow sweet and bitter at the same time, a scent he had become familiar with, but an odor he prayed he would never encounter in his own home. Eileen stood at the counter, grinding something with a mortar and pestle. She looked over her shoulder and smiled at Hubert as he entered the room. His eyes fell upon the small bundle of plants beside her, ones with distinct, plump black berries protruding from star-shaped clusters of leaves, a whimsical appearance for something so deadly. Belladonna. Nearby, a teapot brewing his father's favorite tea sat innocently on the counter. Freezing pellets of fear hammered inside of his chest, and his mind made the connection. Hubert had lunged for the plants and grinding tools, knocking them out of his mother's reach. Eileen had growled in protest as Hubert wrestled the toxic plants away from her. There was no way his father would be unable to detect a poisoning attempt. "He'll kill you!" Hubert had cried. After he disposed of the deadly plants, Eileen had broken down sobbing, apologizing for not being able to protect him. Hubert had wrapped his mother in a tight hug, while rage towards the wretch who had driven his family to this point gnawed at his innards. He would fix this. One day, everything would be put right. There was an uncomfortable ceasefire after that night. The Marquis imparted no further lessons to his eldest child. In fact, he was barely seen at the estate at all. When Lady Edelgard had finally been released from the dungeons, and the true extent of the horrors inflicted on her, the cruel blood experiments, the torture, watching her siblings succumb to death or madness, came to light, Hubert had been cautious. His tone had been even and calm as he greeted his lady liege, and helped her limp away from the foul eyes of Arundel, Marquis Vestra, and Duke Eyre, as he ignored the enraged screams that roared through his head, and bided his time. From that moment, the first pieces of their years-long chess game were put into play. They planned, they plotted, they played nice with their tormentors, careful to keep their masks of civility in place to avoid showing their hands. One by one, they would all eventually pay. The Marquis's time to pay the toll for the cruelty he had inflicted came to pass just before the start of the war. Hubert had built up the confrontation in his head. Thaddeus von Vestra was one of the deadliest assassins Adrestia had ever seen, moving wraith-like from shadow to shadow, lethal with both sword and bow, and brimming with near limitless knowledge of poisons, acids, and other malignant substances that could bend any helpless prey caught within his snares to do his bidding or have them writhe in agony and beg for death. Hubert had heard all the stories before. Even with all the extra training he had obtained from the professor over the last few months, he expected the confrontation with his father to be the fight of his life, one Hubert was not certain he would walk away from. In the end, things had gone quite differently. Hubert had been spotted within seconds of sneaking into the Marquis's palace study. However, instead of retaliating, the man had only turned to Hubert, standing there with his arms spread and a look of resigned surrender on his face. Hubert had growled, dagger in hand, and launched himself at the man like a panther. He had expected his father's disarming gesture to be a feint, something to lull Hubert into a false sense of security. The blade had entered just beneath the rib cage and speared through the wretch's beating heart, just as Hubert had been taught. The Marquis did not put up an ounce of resistance. He had slumped to the ground with a tired groan, a steady stream of blood leaking from the stab wound. A strange look had crossed his father's face as the life drained from his eyes, something that could almost be described as relief, a somber type of peace, one of a torturous life finally coming to an end. Hubert had roared at his corpse, had shaken the body, demanding the Marquis drop the facade and fight him for real. After all the pain and horror the Marquis had inflicted on Hubert, his family, Edelgard, the Hresfeld children, countless others ensnared by volatile suspicions. How dare he die with such a look of peace? Once composed, the front of his uniform coat still soaked with his father's blood, Hubert had summoned the nearby members of the spy network he now commanded, with his first order to be to dispel the wards around the Vestra Manor. Surprisingly, the Vestra agents showed no sign of protest or confusion over the change in command and the new orders they were given, as if they had already been informed that the eldest Vestra child would be taking the reins of leadership that night. When he stumbled his way towards the Vestra Manor, still drenched in the gory stains of his father's blood, Hubert had been greeted by his mother in the doorway. The brittle mask of stoicism shattered. He collapsed into his mother's arms, sobbing. It's over," he had breathed, as he clung to his mother and buried his face in the crook of her shoulder. "It's done." In the present, Hubert and Eileen stood silently in the kitchen, awash in their own memories and processing the information that had been shared. "You must know now why it is imperative why you and the others remain hidden," Hubert bit out, shooting his mother a desperate look. "I still do not like it. Eileen glowered. She grabbed the knife and began chopping at the broccoli and cauliflower again, the hacking movements aggressive and sending showers of green and white florets across the counter. If they are becoming so brazen as to try to abduct crest bearers in a busy city, it will not be long before they start targeting those in the Imperial Army. You said they have already successfully infiltrated Garrick Mach, back when the church was in control of the monastery. What is stopping them from doing so again? Hubert swallowed thickly, knowing full well that at least one of the vermin lurked around the Imperial ranks and continued to flaunt his power over Lady Edelgard. Hubert looked forward to the day he would finally be able to cleave the disgusting sneer off Thalas's face. "Believe me, I am well aware of that risk," Hubert bristled, "which is precisely why Matilda and Theodore should be nowhere near Garrick Mach. Please, they cannot join the war effort until further headway has been made into eradicating those who slither in the dark." Eileen stared at him. She opened her mouth as if to protest, but eventually deflated with a heavy sigh. "Very well," she said with a sad frown. "I will talk to Maddie and Theo. They won't be too happy, but they'll understand. Thank you. Just remember what I said. This is not a battle you should be fighting alone." They returned to their respective tasks, a moment of heavy silence falling between them. "Though it is peculiar," Hubert frowned. "Lady Penelope bearing the crest of Dominique is not a secret per se. However, that particular piece of information has fallen into obscurity, since she had largely withdrawn from Adresti and high society social circles. Perhaps one of these fiends' informants stumbled upon the information and offered the intel as part of an exchange, promises of riches or hoping for some sort of clemency from those vile abominations," Eileen suggested, her hands a blur as she continued to chop and hack at the vegetables. A crash sounded behind them. Hubert and his mother both whirled in the direction of the noise, with matching wide eyes. Ferdinand stood there, frozen, with a strange expression on his face. A smashed teapot lay at his feet. Ceramic shards littered the ground, covering the wood floors with an explosion of jagged, round fragments. Ashen frost had washed over the paladin's face, his amber eyes wide and frozen. He blinked several times, shaking his head, before turning to Hubert and Eileen with an apologetic look. "I am so terribly sorry," Ferdinand stammered. He crouched down to pick up the fragments of the broken porcelain scattered across the floor. "Dropping a teapot, that was unspeakably clumsy of me. I will have a suitable replacement sent to you as soon as I return to Garrick Mach." "'Tis only a teapot, Ferdinand, and not a particularly interesting one at that," Eileen assured him, as she knelt down and helped him pluck the broken shards from the ground. "Please do not waste even a moment fretting over it." Hubert was about to join them when an explosion sounded from outside, rattling the windows and causing the tables to shake. With the knife still clutched in his hand, Hubert sprinted to the kitchen window and peered outside. The defensive tension coiled in his body eased into exasperated annoyance when his eyes fell upon the source of the racket. "It's no cause for concern. We're not under attack," Hubert grumbled, in response to the worried looks Eileen and Ferdinand were shooting him. "Though I will need to have a word with Gautier, and likely Matilda as well." Hubert tossed the knife back onto the counter with a clatter as he stormed out of the cottage. Even before rounding the corner of the cottage, Hubert could see billowing smoke rising from the edge of the clearing, and just out of sight. Hubert gnashed his teeth and picked up his speed, clenched fists held firmly at his sides. Just mere yards away from the tree line, Theodore was frantically casting deluge of ice spells over a still smoldering patch of grass. He looked over at Hubert, cringing, as he summoned more layers of frost to coat the ground and smother that last flickers of flame chewing the grass. Sylvain turned to Hubert, Matilda's bolt-axe in hand, a sheepish look on his face. Matilda was at his side with a smug smirk. "Hey, Hubert! Guess who finally cast Ragnarok?" Sylvain said with a nervous chuckle. Hubert gawked at the wreckage, about 15 square feet of torched grass, blackened and reduced to char. Some of the nearby trees had been singed as well, frost still coating their branches from where Theodore had hastily contained the flames. "By all the circles of hell, are you two trying this at the Woods of Flame?" he yelled, glaring at his sister and the Fargus paladin. That is rather rude, singling the two of us out. Theodore is here as well, Matilda protested, gesturing over her shoulder to her younger brother. Theodore shot an angry look at his sister as he summoned another layer of frost over burnt patches of glowing embers, finally suffocating the last of the sparks. A pillar of smoke continued to rise from the carnage. At least the flames had not hit any of their mother's flower gardens. I leave you alone with my siblings for 20 minutes, and you nearly burned down the cottage, Hubert growled.
Well, we needed to assess your teaching abilities, dear brother,
Matilda huffed, hands on her hips, and a scowl matching her older brother's.
Sylvain has told us all about your tutelage. We just wanted to ensure that the magical education of the Empire's generals was not lacking.
Hubert pinched the bridge of his nose and groaned. And you thought having Sylvain cast fire spells he is inexperienced with was the best way to assess this? I didn't think it went that bad, Sylvain muttered, with a slight wince as he side-eyed what was left of the patch of grass he just incinerated. As if to rebuke his comment, a burnt branch collapsed to the ground with a heavy crash. Hubert glowered at the troublesome duo. So, Matilda, tell me, has my magic pupil met your expectations? Hubert muttered. Matilda hummed for a moment, tapping her finger against her chin as she pondered her answer.
It seems as if your teaching has been adequate enough. All things considered, he was able to cast Ragnarok quite quickly.
Ooh, I wonder if he can cast Meteor. Nobody is casting Meteor. After ensuring there were no traces of sparks to relight a fire, Hubert ushered his siblings back in the cottage to assist with preparing for dinner. Sylvain held back, staring at Hubert with a raised eyebrow and a wry smirk. So, no siblings, huh? Hubert stared at Sylvain in confusion until a conversation they had months earlier, shortly after wiping out the bandit camp and encountering the demonic beast. In my defense, you asked if I had any older siblings. As you see, I do not. Both my brother and sister are in fact younger than myself. Hubert smirked. Sylvain grinned and shook his head. Hubert von Vestra, older brother. You know, it kind of makes sense when you think about it. He chuckled as they meandered their way back to the cottage. I don't follow, Hubert frowned. You act all edgy and spooky, but you mother hen everyone almost as much as Mercedes. I do no such thing. Sure, Hubie, sure, Sylvain chuckled, giving Hubert a rough but friendly pat on the back. The mage bristling like an irate porcupine in response. It must be nice, Sylvain said wistfully, a somber edge to his tone. Hubert remained silent, but gave Sylvain a sympathetic look and placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. When they entered the cottage, they were greeted with the savory aroma of pheasant sautéing in a medley of herbs and spices. The hiss and sizzle of eggs and bird meat cooking in the skillet buzzed in his ear. Hubert sniffed the air with a pleased hum, his eyes fluttering with delight, and his stomach growling in anticipation. Everything should be ready shortly. Eileen smiled as she divided the pheasant, scrambled eggs, and sautéed vegetables onto an assortment of plates. Hubert, would you mind helping Penelope to the dinner table if she is awake and feeling well enough for dinner? Hubert nodded and made his way towards the guest bedroom. To his surprise, Penelope was already up. She leaned heavily against the door's frame, lank ginger hair hanging over her face, her ragged breath shaking her brittle frame. She looked up and smiled weakly at Hubert when she heard him approach. Lady Penelope, I apologize. We did not realize you were awake. Hubert hurried over to the woman and offered her his arm to lean on. We are about to have dinner. If you are well enough, I would be happy to escort you to the dining area. Penelope took the mage's offered arm, clinging to the crook of his elbow. Hubert, may I speak with you for a moment? In private? Penelope asked hesitantly, her face tinged with mingled affection and melancholy. Please, it need only take a moment. It is no trouble at all, Lady Penelope, Hubert responded softly as he carefully led her back inside the bedroom. Despite Penelope leaning most of her weight on him, she felt lighter than a feather caught in a gentle breeze. He closed the door behind them and walked her to the bed, easing her into a seated position on the soft mattress. Hubert's brows knit together with worry as he noticed her shake, reed-like arms trembling with the slight chill of the evening air. "Might I fetch you a blanket? A warm cup of tea, perhaps?" Penelope waved away Hubert's concerns with a small grin. "I appreciate your concern, but I assure you I am not so fragile," she said with a weak giggle and a bright glint in her eyes. "I would assume nothing of the sort." Hubert smiled, taking a seat on the bed beside her. "After all, it is thanks to your combat prowess and timely intervention that I still breathe as of this moment." "And I would not be here at all, had it not been for your assistance," she beamed, placing a gentle hand on Hubert's arm. "Though I did not ask to speak with you just so we could exchange words of gratitude." Lady Penelope went quiet, her countenance turning sombre. Hesitantly, she reached for Hubert's hand, clasping it as tightly as her frail muscles could muster. "Hubert, I wish to ask a favor of you," she said hesitantly, her gaze directed to the ground. Through the veil of ginger hair, Hubert could see her blinking rapidly, holding off a wave of tears threatening to spill from her eyes. "You need only name it, and I ensure I will fulfill your request to the best of my ability," Hubert assured her, as he squeezed her hand. Penelope nodded. She sniffled, but a bright smile lit her face. "Please, look after Ferdinand when I am gone." The words hit Hubert square in the chest, like a paladin's jousting lance. His heart twisted, wrung like a water-soaked rag. He could feel his eyes beginning to sting. Penelope watched Hubert, with earnest kindness in her eyes, patiently waiting for his response. This would normally be the part where one would assure the person making such a request that they would get better, be around to look after the loved one they spoke of themselves, that they would miraculously recover from whatever ailment was threatening to cut their life short. Hubert knew the reality of the situation. Impossible recoveries were a thing of fairy tales. Such illnesses as Ferdinand had described rarely ended with a positive outcome. Lying to her face and deflecting such a request would be an insult to Lady Penelope. "Do not get me wrong. I do not intend to join the goddess's side right away," Lady Penelope said lightly, when Hubert remained silent. "I will do everything I can to hold on for as long as possible, and I have no doubt that Eileen would single-handedly march past the gates of the afterlife and drag me back to the world of the living if I were to pass before Ferdinand returns from the war. A rather astute assessment of my mother." Hubert chuckled, a small sniffle tickling his sinuses. "You are much like her," Penelope smiled, squeezing Hubert's hand. A warm spark flickered in his chest at the comment. He had become used to being compared to his father. Hubert squeezed her hand back and smiled. "I know Ferdinand is strong. He has grown into a wonderful young man, so full of heart, generosity, and kindness," Penelope said with a sad smile. "I could not have asked for a better son." "Ferdinand is largely the man he is today, thanks to you," Hubert told her. He blinked away a water droplet clinging to his lashes. Penelope's smile brightened at the words for a moment, before her demeanour returned solemn once more. "But even with all his strength, I still worry about him. Penelope buried her face in her hand, not holding Hubert's, her words drowned out by a flood of sobs. Hiccups shook her back, with enough force to be mistaken for convulsion. Hubert rested a hand on her quaking back. She lifted her head, and looked up at Hubert with teary, hopeful eyes. "You have my word, Lady Penelope," Hubert vowed, voice firm with conviction. He squeezed her hand, and offered her a reassuring nod. "I promise to protect Ferdinand with my life, and ensure he is well cared for." The words came out quickly, almost naturally. Hubert barely had time to think of them before they escaped his mouth. Though strangely, despite their impulsivity, the words felt right, an unshakable truth that brooked no question, as if the idea of not accepting Lady Penelope's request was an unspeakable impossibility. There was never any doubt, regardless of whether or not their bond became anything more than platonic. Hubert would always be there for Ferdinand. "Thank you," Penelope smiled at him, the lines around her eyes crinkling with joy. "You have My deepest gratitude. I know you will take good care of my son." Once Penelope had wiped her tears, Hubert helped her to the dining room table, where everyone else was already seated with their meals. Eileen stood and pulled out a chair for her friend. Penelope clasped Hubert's hand and nodded at him thankfully as he helped her into the chair. Hubert took a seat between Ferdinand and Sylvain. Eagerly, he grabbed his fork and began stabbing at his eggs and pheasant with ravenous gusto. The first bite was heavenly, the eggs fluffy and seasoned perfectly, the pheasant juicy and soaked spices. His eyes fluttered as he savored the menagerie of flavors dancing along his tongue. "This is delicious!" Sylvain beamed between mouthfuls of food. "I would have killed to have food like this up in Gautier." "Were the meals there much different?" Theodore asked quietly, glancing up from his plate of food before quickly ducking his head and hiding behind his bangs. "Yeah, in Fargus we just boil everything within an inch of its life and drown it in cheese," Sylvain said with a shrug, as he shoved another forkful of pheasant into his mouth. "Most people wouldn't be able to identify a proper herb or seasoning if it robbed them at knife point. Pretty sure pepper is too spicy for most people from the kingdom." "I find that rather surprising, considering several of the Blue Lion students showed impressive aptitude towards the culinary arts," Ferdinand commented as he scooped some bits of eggs onto his fork. "Well, Mercedes is technically from the Empire. Deduce's cooking skills likely come from Duskurian culture, and Ash, well, he's a bit of an outlier," Sylvain said with a shrug, a muffled voice between mouthfuls of food. "Fargus does have a lovely berry sauce they include with much of their cooking," Penelope pointed out. "I used to love putting it on wheat cakes as a child." Sylvain hummed enthusiastically in agreement. "Yeah, thanks Sothis for Albania and its berry sauce, or we'd be stuck eating bland, overcooked gruel every meal. By the way, if you like this, you should really try out adding Albanian berry sauce to the pheasant. It really adds a nice dimension of flavor. And why in all the circles of hell would I ruin perfectly good pheasant by drowning it in sickeningly sweet sugar sludge?" "Ignore this bitter old grump. Sugar pheasant sounds great," Matilda chirped. The light-hearted chatter carried on through the dinner. It was not long before the topic of conversation switched to Hubert and Ferdinand's childhood. "That is certainly not how things happened," Ferdinand gasped, his meal momentarily forgotten as he glared at Hubert. "If I recall correctly, you were the one who decided to find the exit, to count Hevering's hedge maze by melting half the bushes with mire." "Do not exaggerate," Hubert groaned and rolled his eyes, dropping his fork onto the plate with a loud clatter. "It was not half the hedges, nor anywhere close to that amount. I merely cleared enough of a path for us to exit that blasted labyrinth of shrubbery in a timely manner. Besides, we would not have gotten so hopelessly lost in the mage had you not insisted on leading." "Wow, nice job, guys," Sylvain snickered, smirking at the two men. "What did Edelgard think of that whole mess?" Fortunately, Lady Edelgard was not present during that fiasco. She had not been feeling well that day, and had been unable to attend. Alas, my presence was still required at the Hevering estate," Hubert muttered. "I suppose that explains why Waldemar never invited our family back," Eileen said dryly, "though destroying a few hedges pales in comparison to stealing a Pegasus for an impromptu flight, or that one time you launched a banshee spell at a visiting diplomat's son. Can we please stop treading through this spiraling path of my childhood memories?" Hubert groaned as he buried his face in his hands and begged for his mother to end his humiliation. "No, please keep going. This is great," Sylvain said with a grin that could best be described as shit-eating. Hubert shot him a murderous glare. The evening carried on, and soon the dishes had been cleared and an assortment of teas and baked goods had been brought to the table for dessert. As the evening progressed, Hubert noticed that Ferdinand had been unusually quiet, growing less talkative as the night moved on. For most, the change would be nearly impossible to see. A slight downward tick of his lips, an unusual rigidity he held in his shoulders, the way the light dimmed from his eyes. Ferdinand still answered any questions directed at him with his usual cheery disposition, but would revert to stony silence once attention was redirected away from him. Hubert watched him with a worried side glance, but the paladin had given no indication as to what may have been troubling him. He had debated asking Ferdinand directly, but discarded the idea once everyone started to retire for the evening. Once the last of the dishes had been cleaned and put away, the Vester family and their guests departed to their respective sleeping quarters for the night. Hubert drifted to his room, fatigue clinging to his muscles, and his mind clouding with drowsiness. Normally, it would not be unusual for him to be up most of the night, but the events of the last couple of days had finally caught up with him, leaving him with the sluggish feeling that he was swimming through an ocean of syrup. He collapsed onto the bed and was asleep within minutes. A clatter against his door, loud enough to be mistaken for a barrage of catapulted rocks, snapped Hubert from his deep slumber. Initially, he thought the clamor to be the thunderous crashes of a dream, relaying the explosions of magic and the crunch of fortress gates being smashed to splinters during the more hazardous battles that had occurred during the war. He realized otherwise when the sound persisted into his waking state. Hubert blinked, eyelids still glued shut from the clumps of sleep crust clinging to his eyelashes. The banging at his door continued, nearly shaking it from its hinges. A voice accompanied the racket. "Hubert! Wake up! Hubert!" The panicked voice on the other side of the door fired a jolt of adrenaline through the mage's drowsy mind. Hubert jumped to his feet, still garbed in his rumpled sleep clothes. He swept the tangle of knotted bangs away from his face and threw open the door. He bit back a groan when he saw Sylvain's distressed face on the other side. "Sylvain, if these early morning wake-up calls are going to become a habit—" "It's Ferdinand!" Sylvain gasped. "He's gone!" "What?" Hubert snapped, suddenly wide awake, the last sticky vestiges of sleep washed away. "What exactly do you mean by gone?" Even in the dim moonlight, Hubert could see that the paladin's face was ashen, and his brown eyes were wide. His chest heaved, as if he had run laps around the cottage in full armor. Sylvain swallowed thickly, and spoke in a shaking voice. "Well, I was asleep in the sitting room, and the sound of Ferdinand sneaking by and closing the front door woke me up. I got curious, so I followed him outside. I know he's a morning person, but this seemed excessive even for him." "Sylvain! Yeah, the point. I'm getting there. Anyways, I get outside to ask him what's going on, and he just vanishes. Like a warp spell." Hubert blinked. Ferdinand does not possess the faith magic abilities to cast such a spell. Hubert pointed out sharply. "Yeah, I know that," Sylvain snapped back, "but he just up and vanished. Poof! Gone! Just like a damn warp spell." Hubert pinched the bridge of his nose and screwed his eyes shut. There was no way Ferdinand had mustered up enough light magic prowess to conjure a warp spell. Ice jolted through Hubert's veins as the direction of his thoughts took a sharp turn. What if someone else had warped Ferdinand away? An abduction? Was the cottage's location compromised? Where would they have taken Ferdinand? Nightmarish thoughts of Ferdinand captured by those who slither in the dark infested his mind like a swarm of stinging wasps. Images of Ferdinand being subjected to their blood experiments, him crying out in pain under their torture, finding Ferdinand weeks later, staggering from his prison a frail shell of himself, hair bleached of color, and skin crisscrossed with scars, flinching away from anyone who came near. If he would still even be alive by the time Hubert found him. "By the void, must you two make such a racket at this unseemly time of morning?" Eileen's grumbling voice cut through the spiraling cacophony of horrific scenarios parading through Hubert's mind. She approached them with a lit candle in hand, the small flame reflecting brightly in her sleepy, yellow eyes. She blinked owlishly and scowled with confusion at the two men. "Ferdinand has gone missing," Hubert explained, unable to completely mask the threads of unease crawling into his words. "Sylvain claims he warped away, though I fear his disappearance may be more sinister in nature." "I'm telling you, he was the only one there, and he did warp!" Sylvain shouted, flailing his arms as if the gesture would make his argument more convincing. "Warp is not an easy spell to cast," Eileen pointed out with a frown. "Is Ferdinand capable of such magic?" "He is absolutely not, which leads me to believe he may have been abducted." Hubert bristled. "I don't really think he was kidnapped. He was definitely sneaking out, and he looked pissed, Hubert. Like, really pissed off." Sylvain gulped, face pale, and no trace of humor in his expression. "I don't know who got on his bad side, but I'm pretty sure Golden Boy just took off to go flay them. Hubert gritted his teeth and massaged his temples. Images of Ferdinand's unusual behavior towards the end of dinner chewed at his mind. Hubert knew he should have spoken to him. Your theory and observations are well and good, but that still brings us back to our original conundrum. Ferdinand does not have the capabilities to cast a proper warp spell. Unless... Hubert's eyes went wide as an idea clicked into place, like pins and tumblers of a lock snapping into position. As a thief picked them open, he strode towards the sitting room curio. Carefully, he peered through the glass, his breath hitching and his heart twisting into knots, as the sight before him confirmed the theory that had already formed in his head.